Hello, this is Justin at the Tech Train here, and I'm quite excited today to share with you a tutorial I've been planning for a little while. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you two things. First of all, I'm going to show you how to create this 3D model of an island, and I'm using PowerPoint at the moment, but the model was actually made in a different program. I'm going to show you exactly how to create that model, but more than that, I'm going to show you how you can then animate this 3D model in PowerPoint and in fact use the 3D model as a way to show your presentation. So here, for example, we have this little island, and on the island we have a number of notice boards, and we can simply zoom in on each of these notice boards and have a look at the contents just as you would with any normal PowerPoint presentation. But the difference, of course, is that as this is a 3D model and we're zooming around this little island, it makes the presentation that little bit more interesting. So we can zoom in and out, we can move around the island, we can look at any signpost, and we can have as many of these signposts and notice boards as you like and look at each side of them as well if we want to. And I will show you how to make this entire island from scratch. It is actually not too difficult, so we'll be using a program called Blender, which is a totally free program. I've done a couple of tutorials on that before, but I will assume that you have absolutely no knowledge of 3D modeling or of Blender, so this is an absolute beginner tutorial. And you can see how using this 3D model and just a simple background change can make this whole thing feel a little bit like you're actually there on an island perhaps. Here's the dawn and the sunrise and greeting us to a new day. So without further ado, let's get started. So this is going to be a fairly long video tutorial, so I'll break it down a little bit. In the description you will have links to the different sections of this video. Some of them will be optional. I'll show you how to create the island and the notice boards. The extra things, for example, like the shark over here, the rocks and the palm tree, they're a little bit more optional. So I'll certainly show them. I'll explain how to do absolutely everything in this video. But if you want to skip to a section, then that's absolutely fine. I promise I won't mind. So the two things that you'll need first of all are a PowerPoint with either an Office 365 subscription or using PowerPoint 2019. The reason is in the transitions menu, we will need this morph transition. So that morph transition will allow us to be able to rotate around our island after we have inserted it as a 3D model. So if you have an Office 365 subscription or you're using PowerPoint 2019, that is absolutely fine. If you're not sure whether this will work with your version, check out your insert menu and make sure that you can insert a 3D model, and check out your transitions and make sure that you have morph. If you have those two things, then you're absolutely fine for this whole tutorial. And by the way, I will also link the model and this presentation below. I always upload resources and PowerPoint files to my Patreon page, so you can always check that out. But as well as the PowerPoint version, you'll also need to have Blender. Now, Blender is a 3D modeling program. It's quite powerful, but it's also quite straightforward to get used to. It's not too difficult. I will show you absolutely everything from scratch, so I'm assuming zero knowledge whatsoever. If you do have some modeling knowledge already, you may want to skip ahead to a later section. That's absolutely fine. But I'm going to assume for the purpose of this tutorial, zero knowledge. To get Blender, which is totally free, just go to blender.org, and download the version which is suitable for you. This is currently version 2.79b, but we're not going to be doing anything which is going to cause any problems if you're using a slightly older version. So there we are. Those are the two things that you'll need. So once you have downloaded and installed Blender and you've checked that your PowerPoint is the right version, then we'll get started on making the model of the island. So when you start up Blender, this is what you'll see. Click anywhere on this grey area to get rid of the splash screen. I'm just going to switch on screencast keys. What that does is at the bottom left corner here, you'll see exactly which keys I press, which buttons on my mouse I press. So if you miss anything, then you'll see what we are doing. If you've not used Blender before, just a quick word about moving around. You'll need to press and hold the wheel on your mouse button to make your view change, to spin around the scene. And to select things, you'll use the right mouse button instead. So we have a camera here, we have a light there, and we have our cube. So I'm pressing the right mouse button, not the normal left mouse button perhaps you'd use in other programs. And we can also zoom in and out using the wheel on our mouse. So that's a quick overview of moving around. We'll learn more as we go along. The first thing we want to do actually is to get rid of the cube. We don't want it. So with the mouse somewhere in the middle of the screen, it's important that you are aware of where your mouse is, because certain keyboard shortcuts will either do different things or will work or not work depending upon where your mouse is. So if you have your mouse off the side over here, some keyboard shortcuts won't work. So with the mouse in the middle window here, press the delete key on your keyboard and then choose delete from the menu. That's got rid of the cube. We need to now add a flat plane, which will become our island. So on the left hand side here, we're going to click on the create tab and click plane. So there is our plane, just a flat square. And I'm going to scale this up. So to scale, I simply tap the letter S on my keyboard. I don't have to hold it down, just tap it once and let go. And then if I move my mouse out sideways, you can see that plane stretches bigger and bigger. Now I have a kind of guide, a grid on the floor that you can see there. That's not part of the model, that's just a guide for me to see scale. And I'm going to scale up the plane to about roughly the same size as that grid. Then I'm going to click with my left mouse button and that has finished scaling it up. Now there's some little arrows in the middle here which show my three axes, and I'm just going to click on the blue one and lift it up slightly. That lifts the plane up and down. Excuse me. Now I'm just lifting it slightly above the guide just so the guide isn't sort of bleeding through the plane and being a little distracting. Okay, so there we are. That's the first part of our island. Now what we have to do is sort of deform this, and there are two main modes of working in 3D software. One is with the physical models, the actual objects, the blocks, if you like Lego bricks, sticking them together. The other one is where you can take an individual object or Lego brick and twist it and stretch it and pull it and distort it in all sorts of different ways. And to create the rolling landscape of our island, that's what we need to do with this plane. So what I'm going to do is, to begin with, come down to the bottom left area here where we have a menu that currently says Object Mode. Excuse me. I'm going to click on that and switch over to Edit Mode. Now you can switch between object mode and edit mode either by using this menu or more quickly and more conveniently pressing and tapping the tab key. The tab key, if you're not sure, is to the left of the letter Q on your keyboard. So that just switches between object and edit mode. If you're not sure which one you're in, you can check the menu down here. So we're in edit mode and we can see that the plane is selected because it is coloured orange. So what I'm going to do, just slightly look down on this, is I'm going to, the best analogy to think of is if you got a sheet of paper and you wanted to create an origami model or something, you would first of all fold the paper. You'd add lots of creases to the paper, and then you can use those creases to create different shapes. that's kind of what we're going to do with the plane now. We're going to, if you like, add lots of creases that we can then pick at and pull at to be able to create the island. So with the mouse over the middle somewhere, I'm going to press the letter W on my keyboard, and that brings up the specials menu. And at the top, we're just going to choose that first option there called Subdivide. And you can see these lines have appeared now. It's like we've folded that piece of paper into 4. That's not really enough, so I'm going to press W again and choose Subdivide. So that's now added more creases. Subdivide again and again and again. That's probably about right. So I've now got, I don't know how many, is that 16, 32, something like that. I've got quite a few squares. It's not really essential exactly how many you have. Too little and it'll be quite a blocky image. Too many and it gets quite detailed and heavy perhaps on computer memory. So I'm just going to stick with that for the moment. Now, the next thing to do is to make sure we're not selecting any of this model. So I'm going to press the letter A, and A simply either selects all or nothing. And if you've selected, for example, if I just select a few lines and faces there, if you've selected part of a model and you want to only select, select none of it, then you can press A a couple of times and just make sure it's all selected and it's none selected, just on the safe side. Right, so we've got nothing selected at the moment, and we now need to pick and pull at some of these vertices. Now, there are 3 ways of selecting things in a particular model like this. You can either select the vertices, that's the kind of the points where lines meet, like that. You can select the lines themselves, the edges, or you can select the faces. And the 3 ways of selecting are right down here. So we have 3 small cubes on this menu at the bottom, and they're pretty self-evident really. The first one has a little orange corner, one has an orange line or edge, and one has an orange face. So those are the 3 different ways we can select parts of the model. We are going to be using face select later on, but for the moment we're going to choose this first option here, which is vertex select. Now I can select a particular vertex like that, so I can just right click. Don't forget it's a right click to select in Blender. So I can right click, but that only allows me to select one at a time, and I want to select about 3 or 4. So I'm going to right click on a vertex there, then I'm going to hold down Shift, and I'm going to just click on about 3 or 4, 4 or 5, something like that. So I've clicked on about 5 points. And what I want to do now is effectively to pull those points up. Now, if I just simply pull them up, and at this point don't copy what I'm doing because I'm demonstrating the wrong way. If I was to just simply pull them up, you'll see I end up with needles coming up out of the ground, which isn't really what we want. So what I'm going to do is press the letter O on my keyboard. Now if you're really observant, you'll see what just happened there. Nothing in the model happened, the change was down here. So I'll switch it off and then switch it on again, and you can see that little blue dot appearing here. This is what we call proportional editing, and it allows us to have what we call fall off. You can see how the shape basically will appear. Smooth is the default option, that's what we're going to choose, and that will allow us to create smooth hills rather than needles sticking up out of the ground. So the next step, once we've got proportional editing on and we've selected these vertices, is we would press G for grab, so I've got a G, and then I can pull up. Now there's a difference here because you'll see there's a white circle. It may not be brilliantly clear, but in the middle there is a white circle. And if I use the wheel on my mouse, I can make that circle larger, and by doing that I'm creating that soft fall off, so that these points are rounded now rather than spiky needles sticking vertically up. And so you can see that by raising it up and by using the wheel on my mouse to change that, we can create those hills. But a word of warning, because if you're not used to working in 3D, then the whole idea of perspective is really weird. Because if I click here, I know those aren't very good hills, I've done this deliberately, it looks as though I've got 5 little mini mountains there, all pointing directly up. Except they're not. They're pointing backwards. And that's the problem with using a 2D monitor, of course, to work in 3 dimensions. So what we have to do here, we go back to this point, we've got our 5 vertices selected, or however many you've chosen. We've got our proportional editing on. Remember, that's the letter O to switch that on or off. And then we press the letter G to grab those points, and we can use our mouse to soften them. But what we want to do at this point is to limit the grab motion to the vertical axis only, which is the Z axis. So I'm going to tap the letter Z just once, and that now has locked that grab movement to the vertical axis only. So now those hills are only going up, and I can just play around with the wheel on my mouse, and I think something like that will do fine. There we go. So now those hills are going vertically up, and that's looking fine. Now what you can do at this point, if you want to, is we can press A a couple of times to make sure we're selecting nothing, is you can do that process again. So you can right click, holding down Shift on a couple of other points. You can press G and then Z to lock it to the vertical axis, and play around with proportional editing so that you're creating a slightly more randomized terrain. So now that's slightly hillier and a bit more random. So we can play around with the different distortion effects there to create the sort of island we want. I'm just going to put that down a little bit more so it's not too hilly. There we are, that looks about fine. That was right. So there we are, you can play around with that. If you do make a mistake, then as you see, I deliberately made some mistakes there to show you how things could go wrong. So if you make a mistake, don't worry, just press Control Z. That's your undo. And Blender's fairly forgiving. It'll let you undo at least a dozen times, I think. So best advice is if you do make a mistake, undo straight away rather than trying to correct it. Just undo and try again. So there we are, we've now got the island, but at the moment it's a bit flat. It does look a little bit like someone's just tossed a tablecloth or a bed sheet over the area, rather than that being a solid hill. So now what we need to do is add some depth to this. So I'm going to press the letter A to make sure that we've selected the whole of this island. And then what I'm going to do is press the letter E for extrude. So I'm going to press the letter E and then use my mouse to just drag down. So I've tapped the letter E and let go. I'm moving the mouse, but I'm not holding down any keys. You can see that in the bottom left corner. I'm not pressing any keys. I'm just simply able to extrude either up or down. I'm going to extrude down like this and give the island a little bit of height. So I'm going to do something like that and then just click with my left mouse. So now we've added some height to the terrain. It looks a bit more solid, it looks thicker, but we have a problem because the underside here is still as wavy as the top. And if we're going to add some water, that could be an issue. So what we need to do now, a couple of little shortcuts here coming up, is we need to flatten this whole bottom area. So what I'm going to do, basically type 3 different things here. So I'm not going to use the mouse for this. The first thing I'm going to do is press the letter S for scale, but I'm not going to use my mouse. I'm not going to do anything else. I'm now going to lock that scale to the Z axis. So I'm going to press the letter Z. Now you can see a blue line has appeared on the screen. And the final thing I'm going to do is type a 0 on my keyboard. I've used the number pad there, just press 0 and then finally press the enter key. And so what that's done is it's flattened off the bottom of that object. So you can see now I have a flat bottom. So that's looking a little bit more as we want. If by the time you've done that, it'll vary depending upon how your hills are, how rough your hills are. But if there's any particular issue with the height now, we can always do another extrude. So we can press E and just extrude down so that we've got a little bit more height again there. That's fine. Now, one thing you'll notice is that some of it is quite dark, and that's not a lighting issue. The issue is that sometimes it can get quite difficult for Blender to know which of these faces are supposed to be the outside of our shape and which are supposed to be the inside of the shape. And so in order to fix that, what we need to do is press the letter A first of all to select everything, and then use the keyboard shortcut Control N. So I'm going to press Control N, and the difference is that it sort of lightens that up a little bit. It all looks lighter. That means that all the faces we're looking at now are the outside. So all of this is the outside, not the inside of the shape. We can actually look inside the shape. There we are. We're inside the island now, and you can see that those faces are a bit darker there inside. So just Control N there after we've selected everything to create that better effect. Right, so we've got the island. The next thing now is to add the sea. So what we need to do is select all the faces on the bottom again, because I've deselected it in order to flip the normals or flip the faces so they're all facing out. So I'm going to select all the faces on the bottom. Now, there are two ways of doing this. You could, well, first of all, whichever way we do it, we have to switch here to face select. So these three cubes down here, click on the face select. You know you've done that right if you have a dot in the middle of each face. And we can right click now and select these faces. And we can also hold down Shift and select multiple faces, but we really don't want to have to select every face individually. So what we can do is press the letter C for circle, and that gives us this white circle here. I can increase the size of it by using the wheel on my mouse, and now I can just paint over all of these faces and then just right click to get rid of the circle once we're done. So I haven't selected the whole shape because I don't want to. I only want to select the underside, the bottom faces there. So once I've selected the bottom, what I need to do now is, again, a couple of things. I'm going to begin by extruding it, but rather than going down, I'm then going to scale it out and then extrude down. So a couple of shortcuts again here. So the first step is I'm going to press the letter E to extrude, but I'm not going to move my mouse. Instead, I'm going to press the letter S for scale, and then I can use my mouse to scale out. And that sort of created this almost like a second plane, I suppose, like a skirt going around the island there. So I've created that by pressing E for extrude and then S for scale, and then move my mouse. And then once I've done that, I can press E to extrude again and just extrude down. And that's going to be the water for the island. That's going to be the sea. So there we are. We've created the island. We've created the water. The next step will be to add some color. So we're going to do this in two steps. The first step will be to add one color to the entire model, and that'll be the green of the grass. And then we'll paint the sea separately. So let's start off by pressing A to select the whole model. And in fact, I'm just aware that we can see that guide at the bottom there. So I'm going to move the island up a little bit. There we go. So I'm going to press A to select the whole model, and on the right hand side of your screen you have this fairly complicated looking toolbar, but rarely you have to use very much of it. It might be that you can't see all of these buttons in this row here. So if you can't, then, or you don't know if you can, just grab the left hand edge of this panel on the right, click and drag it in a bit, and then you'll be able to see this whole row of buttons here. Now the one we want is the one that looks like a little brass ball. That one's the material tab, so I'm going to click on that, and then I'm going to go plus new. So there we are, we've added a new material by going plus new. And to choose a colour, we just come down to this diffuse section under this sphere here and click on that white section. And that gives us the option to choose a colour for our grass. I'm going to choose a colour here. You can choose the colour or hue in this section, and you can make it darker or lighter by using the slider on the right. So I'm going to choose that kind of grass colour there. That's fine. And then I can click assign to assign it to the object. And I can also rename it. So at the top here we've got where it says material 1. I can double click on that and just name it grass and press enter. There we go. So we've now got the grass material. If I press A, we can take off the orange highlighting because that does make the colours look a little different. And there we are. So we've now got the grass of the island. But of course we might want to change the sea colour. It's a little bit green for sea. So what we need to do now is to select all of these faces around the top of the sea and the side of the sea. And again, what we can do is right click on every single one, holding down shift like this. So we could do that, but of course there's a quicker way. So what I'm going to do, oops, didn't mean to do that. What I'm going to do is to hold down the Alt key on my keyboard. That's just to the left of the space bar. And if I hold down Alt and I right click on one of these faces on the top, it selects all the faces that are directly connected to it in that kind of ring. I can do the same thing for the bottom one here as well. So if I right click while holding Alt on one of these faces, it selects this ring here. And if I hold Shift down at the same time as Alt right clicking, I can then select all of the sea in one go. So that's a little bit quicker. Now, once we've done that, we're going to add a sea material in exactly the same way as we did with the grass. So on the right hand side, I'm going to click plus, new, and then in the diffuse section, I'm going to choose a sea color like that. And if you want to make it shinier or less shiny, you can change the intensity of the specular here. You can see if I drag it right to the right hand side, that's very shiny. Bring it to the left and it becomes flatter. So I'm going to make the sea quite shiny. There we are. Then I can click assign, and I'll also double click up here and just change that to sea. And then if I press A, you can see that now I've got the sea as that color. If I want to, I can even change the side here to a sand color. So again, I'm going to make sure I haven't got anything selected. I'm going to Alt right click on the edge of the island and click plus, new, and it will create a kind of a sandy color like that, and assign it and just name that sand there. And there we are. So we've now got the sand around the edge. Now we're still in edit mode, so if I press tab to go to object mode, you can see what our island looks like, and it looks a little bit more like the island that we were expecting. So there we are, we've got a model of an island. So that's the first step there, creating the model of the island. The next step that we'll need for this is to add the notice boards. So once we've got the island, let's add a notice board and start planting those somewhere around our island. So let's look at how to do the notice board or signpost now. Now, one of the things I've noticed in PowerPoint is it's really good at using these 3D models, but there is a little bit of a problem sometimes when you've got a model created in Blender that's made of multiple component parts, even when you join them together. Occasionally it seems to work, but more often than not it doesn't. I haven't entirely tied down exactly what it is that causes that, but the simplest and most foolproof way of doing it is actually to edit this model rather than adding other models. So if you have some experience of Blender already and you kind of know what I'm talking about, then you'll realize that this is probably not the best way of modeling normally. But for the purpose of what we're doing, which is to create a model that we can put into PowerPoint and animate, this is the best solution. So what I'm going to do is to right click on the island here, and then either go down to the bottom and choose edit mode, or press tab, of course. And I've still got the bit around the outside here selected, so I'm just going to press A a couple of times to make sure that I have nothing selected. The dots, by the way, remember, are just because we still have face select on. You can switch that over to point select or vertex select if you want to. It does make a lot of difference. And then what we're going to do in edit mode for the island model is we're going to come onto the left hand side where it says create and add a cube. Now at the moment that cube is inside the island. In this case it may be visible, but it's appeared inside the island. There it is. So what I'm going to do is, with the cube still selected, I'm going to grab the blue arrow at the top there and just lift that up. There we are. So that cube is now above the island. And now I'm going to look down on the island and use the red handle here to just pull that off to the side, so it is separate and away from the island itself. There we are. Now I need to color this a different color. It's currently green, I think that's the green color. So if I click on the materials button on the right hand side, remember that's the little brass ball, I can see the three materials that I've already chosen, and I could choose any of them and assign it to this cube here. Click on sand. There we are. We colored it the sand color or the sea color, so it's very easy to color it. But I want a slightly different color from this sand. I want a slightly darker wood color. So with this cube selected here, I'm going to click on plus, new, and then I'm going to choose a sort of darker reddy brown color, something like that, but that's a bit too strong, so we'll bring that down a bit, something like that. It's quite shiny, so I'm going to reduce intensity down quite a bit, something like that will do. There we are. That'll be fine. I will call this sign, and I'll click assign, and you can see now that has colored that cube. Now I've come off the cube, so I'm not selecting it, but for what we're going to do, we need to select the cube. But how do we do that? Because it's in edit mode for the whole of the scene, and we can't right click on it because that means I can only reselect a face at a time unless I hold shift down and start moving around, which gets a bit fiddly. So what I'm going to do is use another selection method here, which works quite well. And to do this, I will need to do two things. And we'll be doing this quite a lot, so this is something which will be useful. The first thing is I need to make sure that this model, and in fact all of it, is slightly transparent so I can see through to the opposite side of the model. Otherwise, if I select everything that I can see, all I'm doing is selecting everything that I can see and not the reverse side. That will make more sense in a moment perhaps. So the first thing we do is come down to the bottom here where we have these three little cubes that we've used before for the different selections, and immediately after the cube there's this, I think it looks a little like a drone or something. It's a cube with a little circle in every single corner, but that there is limit selection to visible. If I click it, you'll see that what happens is we can now sort of see through the models. So I can see through the models, they are slightly transparent. Looks a bit weird at first, but that means now that when I select parts of my model, I can actually select the back and the front. So I can select all of it rather than having to revolve around it. Now that looks a little bit odd, and it's not the best way of looking at your model, but it can be useful. So that's the first thing we do. The second thing is to press the letter B. B for crosshairs. B for, I don't know, B for something. And with these crosshairs, I can click and drag a frame over everything I want to select. And you see there I've selected the whole of that little cube, including the opposite sides. Let me show you what would happen if I didn't have that transparency on. So there's transparency on, there it is off. If I use the B now and I select that cube, it looks as though it's all selected, but if we look at the back, you can see that the opposite faces weren't included. So in order to make sure that when I do use those crosshairs, everything inside that frame is selected, I need the transparency to be on. So there we are. I've now selected the whole of that cube, and I need to now scale it. But I don't want to scale it on the vertical. What I want to do is to scale it on the red and green axis, that's the X and Y axis, but I don't want to make it any smaller on the vertical axis. So what I'm going to do is press S for scale, which will allow me to scale the whole thing up or down, but then I'm going to press Shift Z, which basically means scale it on everything except the Z axis. So you'll see it gets wider and deeper, but the height doesn't change. So I'm going to bring that down so it is sort of like a post. I'm going to just zoom in a little bit on that. I think that's about right, something like that. By the way, if you're zooming in and you realize you can't see the object you want to see, you want to slide this whole picture to the right or left. If you hold Control and use the wheel on your mouse, you can slide left and right, which makes it a bit easier to see. So there we are. I think that's about right. We can just move that over here temporarily. I think, yes, I think that's about right. Maybe just very slightly smaller. So again, S to scale, and then Shift Z to lock the Z axis and just scale everything else. There we are. I think that's a bit better. So that's my post now. I'm going to press A a couple of times so that I'm not selecting anything. And for the moment, I can now turn that transparency off. So that limit selection button, the little drone button down here, I'm going to click that off so I'm no longer seeing through my models. So now that we've got the signpost post done, I need to now switch over to face select, this third one here, and right click on the top face. And what I'm going to do is something similar to how we created the sea level at the bottom of this island. So I'm going to press E first of all, which is extrude of course, but rather than extruding up, I'm going to press S to scale it instead. Now I don't want to scale it on all angles, I only want to scale it on the X axis. So I'm going to press X, and that allows me to scale out to the width that I want my signpost, which would be something like that. Let me just undo that and show you all that again. So I right click on the top face, I press E to extrude, and then press S to scale, and then X to limit that scale to the X axis. And then without clicking the mouse, just simply drag it out until you've got that top part of the signpost about the right width, something like that will do. There we go, and then click with the left mouse button. Once I've got the bottom part of this sign section, I can then press E to extrude and just simply extrude up to create the main sign. And what I'm doing here is creating it in a way that is proportionally about right for the PowerPoint presentation, because of course this will be the slide, or at least the main frame in which the slide contents will appear. So I'm trying to get this to be about the same shape and size as the monitor or screen that the presentation will be shown on. If you're showing this presentation on a 4:3, you might want a slightly narrower signpost perhaps. I'm using 16:9, more widescreen, so I'm having a little bit wider, but you can play around with that. So there we are, I've got my signpost made, so that's it. Now, because we're editing all of this effectively as one model, it's important to have, to have this signpost here made quite separately from the islands. You see there's a good distance between the two. That allows me to use that B method to create the crosshairs and select the whole of the signpost so that, so that I can move that around. What have I, let's try that again. B, there we are, and course, I switched off the limit selection. So there we go. You see, that's a classic example. I forgot I switched that off earlier on. So the back is not selected on that signpost. So let me just switch that limit selection back on so I can see through everything. B for my crosshairs, select the whole of that signpost, and there we are. We can now move that signpost around. So I've created it separately from the island so that I can now select the whole of the signpost without having to select part of the island as well. Now the next thing I'm going to do is look down on my island, and I could look down on it like this, which is fine, but there are some keyboard shortcuts which are really useful. I'm just going to switch off the limit selection just so it's a bit easier to see the model now. On the number pad, and if you don't have a number pad, this obviously won't work, but if you have a number pad, then if you press the number 7, that will allow you to look down on your world. But what you'll notice, is probably a little bit easier to see on the signpost there, is that perspective is still on. So you can see, for example, this hill here is overlapping the sea because of the fact that perspective means that's a bit nearer us and therefore looks a little bit bigger. And the signpost as well, you might just be able to see that the top of the signpost then is to the right, and the post sort of is heading down and to the left there. So what we want to do is to actually switch perspective off. In the view menu, there is the option here to view either with perspective mode or orthographic mode, which is sort of like an architect's view of something. And you can use the you can either use that menu there, switch that menu on there, or as you can see, number pad 5. So pressing the number 5 on the number pad switches off the perspective, so now you can see it as it is mathematically, if you like, completely square, and that is completely square as well. That does make it a lot easier for placing objects on your island. So again, I'm just going to switch that off and just show you that again. So there's my island, there's my signpost selected. So I'm going to press 7 to look down on everything, and then 5 so that I can switch off perspective. Pressing 5 again on the number pad just makes perspective back again. It is probably good to get perspective back because it does look weird. Something about that does not look right normally. That's orthographic. That's perspective, so you can see the difference is quite obvious. So 7 to look down on it, 5 for perspective off, and now with this signpost selected, I can press the letter G to grab it and move it wherever I want. Now I'm going to have 4 of these signposts, and I'm going to place them in the 4 corners of my island. So I'm going to place one there, and I'm going to click. Now before I click anything else, it's really important I don't click anything else, because at the moment that signpost is still selected and only the signpost is selected. It's probably going to be partly buried in the island now, so if I wanted to select that signpost again, it would be a bit tricky. So what I'm going to do is make sure that that signpost is positioned without selecting anything else. So I'm going to make sure it's still selected and click down. Just to, you see that signpost burying in the ground there. So that's buried in the ground. Then I'm going to press 7 again to look down on it, and then R to rotate. And you can see I can rotate that around now to face whatever angle I want. There we go. So it's buried in the ground and it is rotated. In fact, actually, I think I'll rotate it the other way so it's facing sort of into the island. There we are, like that. Okay, now with the notice board still selected, I want to make a copy of it, and we duplicate selected objects by doing Shift D. So hold down Shift and press the letter D. That creates a duplicate of whatever you've selected, and that now follows the mouse. So I'm going to now place my next signpost somewhere over here, and I'm going to press R to rotate it, and then with the middle mouse button change my view so I can come down here and just use the blue arrow to make sure that is buried in the ground. There we go. Then I'm going to press letter 7, sorry, number 7 again. Shift D to select that signpost, drag it over here, rotate it with the letter R, and then just have a look and check that that is buried in the ground. There we go, that'll do. Press the number 7 to look down on it again. Shift D to duplicate one more time. Place it over here. Press the letter R to rotate it. And then again the middle mouse button to change my view, and use the blue arrow to just make sure that signpost is buried in the ground. There we go. So we've still got, as you can probably tell, orthographic mode on. So I'm going to press the number 5 on my number pad to take that off, so I have normal perspective mode again, and then I can press tab to come back into the kind of model view. And there we are, we can see our model now. We can see those signposts on my island. So at this point, for many of you, that may be enough. You might be quite happy just to stick at that point with an island and the signposts, and you could do everything in PowerPoint at this point that I showed you earlier on. The only extra things that I'm going to cover now in the modeling are things like the rocks, the shark fin, and of course the palm tree. Now these are extra options, they're not strictly speaking necessary. So if you want to skip the next part of the video, please do feel free to do that. In the description below I have put links, or will do, links to the different parts of this video, so do feel free to drop down to the description, click on the bit for exporting a model ready for PowerPoint. And at that point we'll just move on with the model and showing how we bring that into PowerPoint and start animating it. But if you would like to know how to create the rocks, which is what I'll do next, then stay tuned, and that bit is coming right up. So let's do the rocks now. So the rocks are really quite straightforward actually. Again, like the signposts, we're going to make the rocks within the same model, so we're not going to create an additional object and join them. Normally that's how you would work in Blender, but for some reason PowerPoint doesn't like that very much. So what we're going to do is right click on the island and tab into edit mode again. So at the moment I have this last signpost that I was editing selected, so I'm going to press A a couple of times just to make sure that nothing is selected at the moment. And to begin with, what I'm going to do is on the left hand side in the Create tab, I'm going to add an icosphere. So there's two, there's a UV sphere and an icosphere. So an icosphere is the one we want, and as before it's appeared inside the island there. So I'm going to click the blue arrow to drag it up, there we are, and then the green arrow to drag it off to the side. And in the same way that we needed the signposts to be quite separate from the island so that we could use that B to drag a border or boundary around the object and select all the faces, we need this icosphere off to the left as well. So at the moment the icosphere has the same green, default green background, because that was the first texture that we added to our model. So anything that we add now is always going to have that color to begin with. So I'm going to change that. The icosphere currently is completely selected, so we can see all the faces of it are selected. So on the right hand side in my materials tab, I've got these 4 materials at the moment. I'm going to click on the plus button and then new to add a new texture. And I'm going to click in diffuse but not change the color. I'm just simply going to drag down this slider on the right, which is the brightness. So we have a fairly dark grey color. So you can see that's a fairly dark grey. It's quite shiny. We don't want it shiny, so I'm going to drag the intensity way down there. In fact, probably turn it almost off for that, I think. And I think that's probably about right. We don't want it absolutely black, but I think a dark grey like that would be fine. So there we are, we've got that grey. We'll just name this rock, there we go, and then click the assign to assign it to all the faces that we currently have selected. So if I press A to select nothing, you can see I have that grey sphere. Now an icosphere is quite good because it isn't a perfect sphere, of course. It's got these knobbly shapes. It's there's probably a mathematical term for that shape, but I have no idea what it is. But what we're going to do is drag and pull points on this icosphere. So I'm going to start with my vertex select. Remember, that's this first cube down here. And all I'm going to do is click on one of these points here. And in fact, what I'll probably do to save time is hold down Shift to just click on 2 or 3 of those points at the same time. And then I'm going to press S to scale and just scale those points out a bit. There we go. Then what I'm going to do is use edge select. I'm going to select a few edges here as well. And I'm going to press S to scale those out. Now I'm not doing a massive amount of moving each time because that can make it quite distorted. But all I'm going to do is just select a few vertices at random and then press S to scale them out. And I have proportional editing off, by the way, for this. So remember the proportional editing, which we had earlier on, we pressed O to bring that on. So that is off for this. In fact, we won't need that on again now, so we can make sure that's turned off. Right, let's just pan across there and have a look at this from a different angle. So again, right click on a few of these and press S to just scale those out. What we're really doing here is just trying to make the whole thing look a little bit less like a perfect sphere. So we can pull these in a little bit as well, perhaps. There we go, try that. Just press S to scale them in, and then a few more. And the more you do on this, the more clicking and randomly scaling up or in, the more random the rock will appear. So I'm not going to spend too long on this, but this is a very quick and simple way of creating a rough rock. Now I could carry on with that. I think I'll just pull these out here a little bit. Press S to scale those out. In fact, I think what I might do on this one is use point select and just point that one out. Oops. So press S. Just widen that a little bit. And in fact, I think what I'm also going to do is right click on that and just use the red arrow to pull that out a little bit. So you can use the red arrows or whichever arrow you want here to pull parts of it out. That one here, I think I might pull that point out. I'm going to press right click on it and press the press the red arrow there to pull that out. Not too much, I don't want it too pointy. There we are. I'm going to stop at that point. You can probably see the idea and you can see how it's possible to carry on playing with this quite a lot. I am just going to press B to bring up these bounds here, and I'm going to click and drag across the whole of that cube. Now you see I haven't got the back of the rock selected because I didn't have this restriction button on. So I'm going to click that, which allows me to see all the way through it. Press B, drag across it again, and there we are. I've now got it selected on both sides. And I think what I'm going to do is just press S, and I'm going to restrict the scale to the vertical axis, which is Z. So I'm just going to squash it on the Z axis a little bit like that. There we go. I think that's about right. Just that little point there I think is probably sticking out a little bit too much. There we go. Right, so with our rock selected, which I'll just do again by pressing B and drawing across the whole thing, what we can do is place that at random on the island, like we did with the signposts. So I'm going to press 7 to look down on my model, and press 5 to make sure that my view is not perspective, so it's not distorted by the perspective. Right, let's move that rock, and I'm going to put one rock about there, I think, somewhere like that. So once we've placed it, we can then look at it from a different point of view. We need to sink that down so it's slightly in the ground like that. There we go, that's fine. press 7 to look down on it again, and to duplicate it, it's Shift D. And we must do that whilst it is still selected. Shift D. So I'm going to place this rock, now it's clearly a little bit too low down for me to see, so I'm going to just change my view and lift that up again. Press 7 to look down on it, and G to move that around. And I think this rock's going to go inside here. But we don't want the rocks to look the same, so I'm going to press R and just rotate it around a little bit. And I'm also going to press S for scale, scale it on the X, just stretch it out a little bit, and maybe also scale it on the Y to make it a bit narrower, just so it looks different from the other rock. There we go. And then I can sink that down into there. I think I need to rotate it so it's sort of going along this valley here. So let's press 7 and then R to rotate it. So something like that. Just scale it so it's a little bit smaller. There we go. And just use the arrows to sink that down into the ground like that. There we are. That's about right. Make sure it's actually in the ground, touching the ground. There we are. That's fine. And I think we'll do one more. So I'm going to press Shift D again, bring that out. Of course, I've distorted the original rock. What you can do if you want is to keep your original rock off to the side, duplicate it each time, and move it into position. And then once you've got the final rock, that you can either move that into position and that's it, or just delete that rock by pressing the delete key on your keyboard. So you've got your basic template always kept off to the side. That's entirely up to you. Right, let's just try this one. I think what I'm going to do for this one is move that here. Well, let's lift that up. And I'm also going to rotate it, I think, on this axis. So it's sort of sticking up a little bit more, like a sort of monolith or something. Rotate it that way. There we go. And then move that down into there. There we go. I think that's fine. So there we go. That's the rock. So I'm going to press A a couple of times so I'm not selecting anything, and then press Tab to go back into my model view. And there we are. We can see we've now got 3 rocks. It's looking good. So I'll press 5 just to come out of orthographic view, so we're back in perspective view. That obviously looks a little less distorted then. So there we go. So now we've got our island, we've got our signposts, and now we've got our rocks. The next step would be to add our palm tree. Now again, this is an optional step in this model making process. You don't need a palm tree for this to work in PowerPoint, of course, but if you're interested in how to make the palm tree, which is a little more complex than the rocks, certainly, but if you're interested in that, then this is what the next section will look at. If you're not interested in the tree, that's absolutely fine. Feel free to skip ahead to the next section. So let's get started with a tree then. If you're still watching this video at this point and you're having a go at the tree, then well done. It's not too difficult, but again, there are little things that we're going to do which I've not ever covered before. So even if you've looked at my previous videos, this will probably be new. So what I'm going to do to begin with is to add a cylinder. So once again, we're going to go into the edit mode of this model. So I'm going to right click on the model, tab to go into edit mode, and just press a couple of times to make sure that we're not selecting anything. Right, let's add our cylinder then. So I'm going to click on cylinder, and then again I'm going to move that up and to the side so that it is away from our main model. There we go. Now the cylinder is going to be the trunk of the tree, and at the moment it's a fairly odd colour for a trunk. It's green. I'm simply going to use the brown that I used for the sign. I suppose it makes sense that the signposts on this island have been made out of perhaps a second tree which used to be on the island. So I'm going to click on the sign wood colour here and then click Assign to assign that colour to the tree. Now this is going to be the trunk. It's obviously too wide. If I just move that over and up a little bit, we get an idea of scale. You can see how that is massively too big. Let's move that slightly above there so it's not going to be part of that same mesh. Let's resize it so it's going to be more the sort of size of the trunk. So I'm going to press S to scale. You'll see that scales the height as well, which we don't want. So I'm going to press Shift Z so that the height isn't affected, only the other two axes. So I'm going to have the trunk, and I'm thinking here about the base of the trunk. It'll get narrower as we go up, but I think in terms of a base, it's going to be about that sort of diameter there. That'll do. Right, let's just move that off to the side again as before. A little bit further so that it's definitely separate. And now what I'm going to do is change the height so that the trunk is the right height for a tree. So I'm going to press S to scale, and this time I only want the vertical. So I press the letter Z, and there we are. We can make that trunk. So that's fine. I think that'll do for the height. Right, now once we've got the trunk in terms of height, it needs to be sort of bent in different sections. We need to split it up and shove it around so that it's a bit wonky, a bit wobbly. So if you see the example I had before, the trunk kind of zigzagged up a little bit like that. So what we need to do here is add what we call loop cuts. So with this model selected still, I'm going to press Control R. Control R. That has this little pink ring that you can see around it. And if I click with my mouse, I can drag that down to about there, about a quarter of the way up, and then click. And that's basically divided each of these very tall faces into two separate faces, a bit like this sort of line along here. So I've basically added edges across there. I'm going to do the same thing again, so press Control R and then move that down. I'm sort of dividing this into quarters really. Control R again and about there. You can add more. The more you add, then the more detailed it'll be, of course. But for the moment, I'm just going to keep things quite simple. There we go, that'll do. Now I'm going to be using my B selection again, like that. But remember that it'll only select, as you can see there, the faces that we can see, not the ones at the back that we can't see. So we must make sure that this limit selection to visible option is on so that we can see through. You can now see it's completely transparent. You can see the edge there at the back. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use B to select the whole of that loop cut we made there, and I'm going to do two things. I'm going to move it off to the side, and I can either use the arrows here to just move that off to the side there, or I can press the letter G, which more or less does the same thing. I can also move that up and down if I use G. There we go. And I'm going to look at it from different angles as well, because otherwise it's only zigzagging in one direction. It's not sort of going forwards and backwards as well. There we go, that'll do. And I'm also going to just scale it. So as you go up the trunk, each joint is slightly smaller than the one before. So having shoved it off to the side, I'm going to press S and just bring that in just slightly like that. There we go. Press A couple of times to make sure nothing's selected, and do the same thing for this one. So press B, draw a frame over the whole of that edge. There we go. And then we can press G to just move that into position for the next one. Something like that will do. And then S to scale it so it's slightly smaller than the joint below. Right, press A a couple of times and then B, select that joint, move that off to the side, perhaps that way slightly. There we go. And then scale it so again it's smaller than the one below it. And then finally the top. So we'll move that off to this side like that and scale that right down so that's much smaller. There we go. So that there is our trunk. So we've made the trunk. I think I might just maybe move that off in that direction there. So we're rotating this island around in our PowerPoint, so it needs to look sort of wonky and crooked from every different angle. So I think maybe also I might just move that off there slightly as well. There we go. Oops, a bit too much. There we go. I think that'll do. Right, so we've now got our tree trunk. The next thing that we can do is to add that to our island. We're going to do that separately from the leaves. So to do this, I'm going to press B and select the whole of my tree. And notice how, because I've kept the tree model separate from the island, I don't have to overlap my frame with the island. You can see if I do that, I end up selecting these edges down here as well, or vertices rather. So it's really important that when you do the B frame, you can do that without selecting any of the island. So there we are, we've selected the whole of that tree trunk. I'm going to press 7, and in fact now we can turn off the restrict selection as well. So press 7 and 5 as well, just so we're not worried about perspective. And then I can press G to move that tree trunk into the middle. I think it needs to be right on top of that hill in the middle there. There we are, I think that'll do. And then we'll just make sure that it's in the ground, but only just in the ground, like that. There we go. Yeah, I think maybe just slightly further over to here. Yep, that looks good. So once you're happy with that, we can select nothing. So press A a couple of times. Just going to press 5 again to put perspective back on. So there we are. We've now got the tree trunk in the middle of our island. So the next step, and of course you could again have that tree trunk off to the side, and before you start moving it into place, you could duplicate it 2 or 3 times so that you can have more than one tree on your island. I'm not going to worry about doing that in this video, but I'm sure you can see how in the same way that we did with the rocks and with the signposts, you could have multiple trees on your island. You could have a little forest in the middle if you so wish. But I'm going to stick with just that one tree now. So having added the trunk, we need to then think about the leaves. So what we're going to do now with nothing selected is add a plane. So I'm going to click on plane and then grab my green arrow and slide that off to the side. There we go. Now, of course, this is colored green by default, and that's absolutely fine. We'll have that green for the leaves. I think that'll be okay. But what I'm going to do is just scale that out so it's a bit of a longer rectangle. So I'm going to press S to scale and then X just to stretch that out so it's more sort of palm leaf proportions. There we go. Just maybe scale that. Oops. Scale that on the Y-axis, I think. Yeah, there we go, like that. Okay, so now we are looking at the palm leaf, but of course it's just a rectangle. We need to move the points around a little bit. So just as we did with the tree trunk, we're going to add some loop cuts. So I'm going to press Control R, and you'll see that you'll either get a line going from end to end. You can see a pink line there going from one end to the other, or a line going widthways across it. It depends where you put your mouse. If I put my mouse on the long edge, you can see that my pink ring line goes across. If I move my mouse to one end, then it goes from one end to the other. Now what I'll want is actually to do a couple. So I'm going to add one ring that goes right the way across. So we're going to click and place that roughly in the middle. And then I'm going to press Control R again and add a ring about there. And then finally Control R again and a ring about there. There we go. So now what I'm going to do is make sure that I'm on Vertex Select, and I'll just make sure I've got nothing selected to begin with. And I'm going to right click and then hold Shift down and right click again. So I've selected these 2 points here. And what I'm going to do is press S to scale and just bring these in to a bit of a point there like that. And I think what I'm also going to do now is use Edge Select and just select those 2 small edges and bring those out slightly like that. There we go. And now I'm going to do the same thing with the other end as well. So with Vertex select, select these two corners, scale them so that they come into a point like that, then use edge select to select these two edges and then just pull those out like that. There we go. Now at the moment it is a very straight leaf, and we need it to be a bit more curved than that. So for this, what I'm going to do is actually switch proportional editing on again. This is what we used for the hills to make the curves of the hills. So I'm going to click on proportional editing, which is the letter O on my keyboard. And I've got these two edges selected here already. So what I'm going to do is press R to rotate. And you can see as I move my mouse up and down, it's giving that leaf a sort of curved effect to it. And I'm just looking for something that's sort of roughly palm shape. Something like that will do fine. So just play around with that so that you get that sort of curve there. I could do the other one as well. I think I will. I'll do the other one as well. So I'm going to make sure nothing's selected. I'm going to make sure I've got edge select on. Select these two edges here. Look at it sideways. Press R to rotate. Now, of course, I've got a very large circle, which I'm going to reduce slightly like that, so that it's not having quite the same effect. There we are, something like that, just so it's not too flat. There we are, good, that'll do fine. And I think what I might also do now is select this middle line here and the one at this end. I'm holding shift down so I can select more than one edge. And with proportional editing still on, I'm going to try and do this. I'm going to just lift that up slightly like that. You see, as I lift it up, it kind of creates a sort of canopy. I hope you can see that. So it's sort of more like a tent almost. Can you see that? So there it is, sort of flat. And if I lift it up, it creates that sort of V shape there. That's a little bit too much. So let's just put that down a bit there. There we go, that's fine. So that is our basic palm leaf. Fairly simple, but it'll work for what we want. And now what I need to do is make sure that we select the whole of that palm leaf. So B, and then just select the whole thing. Right, so I'm not going to move this palm leaf off and over to here, because we're going to need quite a few leaves. And I don't want there to be any risk of that. So I'm going to keep this one here and just press Shift D to duplicate it. And it's this copy of a leaf which I'm going to move into position. So I'm going to move that up. And this can get a little bit fiddly, I guess, just moving it into position. And also thinking about scale, because, I just realized I've still got proportional editing on rather. Let's just switch that off, because that is starting to affect a few things. So do make sure the proportional editing is off once you've finished making the leaf. Now we can see that this one here is far too big for a palm leaf. I've also put the wrong end on there. There we go, that'll do. So I'm going to just scale that down a bit so it's more the sort of right size for a palm leaf. I think that'll do fine. So this is the one now which I'm going to be duplicating. So I'm going to just move that over to there and then rotate it so it's pointing down slightly like that. Don't worry about the trunk peeking through here, because we'll be adding quite a lot of leaves, so that's absolutely fine. Right, there, we're going to look down on my leaf. Let's press 7 and 5 just so that I can see what I'm doing more clearly. There we go. I'm going to Shift D to duplicate that leaf again. Then I'm going to press R to rotate it, and then move that into position again, roughly like that. And then before I duplicate it again, let's just have a look at it from all angles, because the one problem with working on a single model rather than separate blocks, as we might normally in Blender, is that once you've let go of something, it's going to be quite difficult to move it around or edit it again in future. So there we go, that'll do for that one. 7, again, to look down on it. Shift D to duplicate, R to rotate it, move it roughly into position, and then just play around with things like the height and angle. You don't want it to be too precise. It doesn't have to be exact because this is a natural thing we're trying to create. There we are. So Shift D to duplicate that again, G to move it into position, and then just have a little look and check that that's looking all right. Once you get a few on there, it starts to get a little bit easier because all the overlapping means that any issues you've got with the trunks peeking through or whatever will be forgiven at this point. There we go. Shift D again, rotate, and move that into position. Just double check that it's not too low, so just double check your heights and everything as you're going on. Again, if you make a mistake, don't forget you can just Control Z at any point to undo your mistakes. It's not a problem. There we go. And you could add more on top of that. Of course, you could add a second layer if you want to, but I'm just going to keep it nice and simple. So there we are. That will do. I think I'm okay with that. Yeah, I could carry on fiddling with this for ages, but I don't want to take too long. This video is probably already quite long. So that'll do for now. We do have this original template leaf over here, which I want to get rid of. So I'm just going to press 7 to look down on it, A to make sure that I'm not selecting anything, B to draw a frame around this leaf, and then I can press delete on my keyboard and delete all of the edges, which will delete the whole object. So there we are. So now if I tab out of that, you can see I have my island with my palm tree in the middle of it now as well. The next step and the final step in the modeling process really is the shark, which is fairly straightforward. Again, it's an optional one. Feel free to skip past it if you want to, but I will now show you how to make your shark. So the final step of modeling then is the shark, just the shark fin, which you can see that I added, you can just about see it there, I think. I'll move this around, you can see. There we are, this is in PowerPoint now. So it's a very simple triangle that we've got there. That's all we're looking to model. So what I'm going to do here is, again, right-click on my model and press Tab to go into edit mode. Press A couple of times to make sure that I'm not selecting anything, and then we need to add a plane. So once again, we'll move the plane off to the side so that we can see it more clearly. And for this, we clearly need a fairly dark, menacing color. So pale green is not a good color for a shark. So we're going to click on the plus button and then New, and add a similar color to the rock, but I think just a bit darker. So let's add a darker one here. But of course the shark's fin is wet from the water, so we can have a bit more shine than the rocks might have. We'll call this shark and assign it to the selected plane. It looks orange because it's selected, but that's absolutely fine. If we were to press A, you can see that that is a fine color for a shark. By the way, if you wanted to change the color afterwards, you can do. You can click on any of these materials here. If you think, oh, that sounds a little bit too dark, I wanted it a bit brighter, or the shark's a bit too light, I wanted it to be darker, you can do just simply by selecting the material and then clicking on the color, and you can see if I increase or decrease the brightness, it actually affects the object in the scene. So if I want to make it a bit darker, like that, I can do very easily, and that works for all these materials. Right, let's now look at this shape here. We want to create more of a triangle shape. It's a bit too square. The shark's fin is not a 90-degree angle. So I'm going to look down on my scene, first of all. So let's press 7 to look down on it. Press 5 to make sure that I don't have any perspective on, which could distort what I'm seeing. Position that so I can see it nice and clearly, and then I'm going to use the vertex select here. So I'm going to click vertex select, press A so nothing is selected, and then select one of these corners, doesn't matter which one. And all I'm going to do is press G to move that off, and this is going to be the fin sticking up out of the water. So I'm picturing a shark fin something like that. There we go. Now these other ones don't matter too much, but I'm just going to bring them up a little bit like that, just so that it's a bit easy to see. So it looks like the back of an aeroplane, I suppose, the fin at the back of an aeroplane. So there we are, that's my shark fin. Now at the moment that shark fin, if I just take perspective off so we can see it more clearly, put perspective on, that shark fin is too thin, so we need to add some depth to it. So I'm going to click on the face select and then select the one and only face on this fin, and then I'm going to press E to extrude it. Now we don't want it to be too thick, but something like that I think will do fine. So if I press tab, you can see that shark fin like that. There we go. Right, now at the moment it is of course lying down. We need to rotate it. So let's press R. Oh, first of all, yes, it is selected. No, it's not. Let's go back into model view. I'll put on the limit selection, or unlimit it rather, so that I can select the whole of my shark, the bottom and the sides, back, everything. And then I will rotate it. So I press R to rotate. And in fact, it's rotating in two different axes. So what I'll do is which axis is going to be rotated along the red axis there, which is the X axis. So I'm going to press R, X 90, and then press enter, and that's rotated at 90 degrees exactly, so that's fine. Right, let's look down on my scene again, take off perspective, and I don't need the limit selection now, so I'll put that on. And now I'll move my shark over the water somewhere like that will do, and we'll rotate it so it's facing the right way. Now it's a little bit too low down. We need him to be a little bit more visible than that, so we'll just rise that up a little bit. There we go, that's perfect. So there's one shark. Let's look down on the scene again and do a Shift D to duplicate, and we'll add another one on this side. There we go. We'll just I think that looks fine at that angle. We don't need to rotate it. So there we go. We've added a couple of sharks to our scene, and if I take orthographic off, so we're looking at it from perspective, press tab, so we're back into model view. There we go. So we can see our little island with our signposts, our rocks, our palm tree, our sharks, and our sea. So we've now finished making the model for our presentation. So the next step will be to export this model in a format that we can then use in PowerPoint, and then look at PowerPoint and see how we can import the model and start animating it so that we can create a presentation from it. So let's move on now to exporting and importing this model. So the first thing we want to do is to save this model as a Blender file first of all, so that if we want to go back into Blender and edit our model or add anything else to the model, change our materials, anything like that, we still can. So go into the File menu and choose Save. I've already saved mine, so I'll click on Save As so that you can see what you would see. And on the left hand side you'll have your usual drives. So you can go to the location where you want to save it, and then up here in this bar that's colored red, type the name of the file, whatever it is you want to call it, and then on the right hand side, save as Blender file. So that'll save it as a Blender file, which you can then open in future by going to File and then Open. But we also need to save it in a format that we can then use in PowerPoint, because PowerPoint can't, certainly at the moment, use Blender files. So what we need to do now is click on File and come down to Export near the bottom. And the format that we need to use if we're going to use this model in PowerPoint is FBX. So it's File, Export, FBX. Click on that. And as we did with the save, just go to wherever it is you want to save it. In the name, I'll call this Island Demo. And then just click Export FBX. So there we go, that's that done. So now what we'll do is have a look in PowerPoint at how we can import that model and start animating it. So I'm going to create a new presentation from scratch. I'm going to set my layout to blank, and I'm going to add a background at the moment for the sky perhaps. I'm going to add a gradient, and I'm going to stick with that one there. Perhaps just maybe make that slightly more blue, like that. There we go. So it's a blue sky background. That'll do. And now I'm going to go to Insert at the top there, and then 3D Models. And you'll have two halves to this button. Click on the bottom half and choose the option from a file. So here we can now go into the area where we've saved it. I'll put mine on the desktop. So there is the island demo file, the FBX file that we just saved. I'm going to double click that. And there we are. Now, interestingly, this usually happens. PowerPoint imports it upside down. Not a problem. So you'll see that in the middle there is this little circular button with these two rotation icons here. If you click on that, you'll find that you can just simply drag your model around so that you can face it in any direction. There we are. Now let go of that and then click on it again so we can actually move the model around and look at it from any angle. What I'm going to do then, I'm going to just zoom out slightly here because I want to make my model a bit bigger as well. So I'm going to hold down Shift and use the corner here so that I'm scaling that model out without risking any distortion. And it can get a little bit tricky to see what you're doing here. I find that it's a lot easier to look at the thumbnails here. So I keep moving it around and then checking my thumbnails. Now I'm going to leave my first slide like that so that effectively we're looking at the island. If I just press play here, we're looking at the island from this point of view. What I'm going to do now though is I'm going to duplicate this slide. So I'm going to press Control D to duplicate it. That's important. And then on this second slide, I'm going to now move my island. So I'm going to rotate it like this. And I'm going to zoom in a bit. Now to zoom in, all I have to do is just make the model bigger. There's no actual zoom, it is just simply making the model bigger or smaller. So there we are, I'm going to do it like that. Let's move that up slightly so we can see the sand. There we go. Right, now what I'm going to do is now, with either of these slides selected, I'm going to go up to Transitions. And it's really important, the transition we're going to use is Morph. So we're going to click on the Morph transition, and then I'm going to click Apply to All. Of course, if you have other slides in your presentation that are totally different from this, then you may only want to apply the Morph transition to those that contain the island. But in this case, it's going to be the whole presentation. So I'm going to click Apply to All. And now if I run my presentation, there's slide 1. Look what happens when I go on to slide 2. So PowerPoint morphs between the two by rotating and enlarging the model itself. Really cool. So now we can see how we can set up the slides. So that was my slide 2. Let's duplicate that slide again, Control D. And this time I'm going to choose a sign that I want to zoom into. I want to zoom in on this slide here. So what I'm going to do is rotate it so that that slide is facing forwards. I'm going to zoom out pretty much as far as I can and then make this model really big. And what I'm looking at here is the size of this rectangle here compared to the size of the slide there. So I'm going to make this quite a lot bigger. There we go, and just move that off slightly so you can see it's still, I can't zoom out much more than this, so I'm going to have to move the model up and just drag that out as much as I possibly can. There we go. And you see how it's quite difficult now to sort of see the slide. So I'm using the thumbnail over here to move that signpost up. There we go, a little bit further perhaps. Oops. Let's use the arrow keys to move that down. There we go. I think that'll do fine. We can make it bigger if we wanted to. We can change the size by clicking on the Format button at the top. This is now height 347, so if I increase that, I believe it will increase proportionally. There we go, yes it is. So I'm clicking on that. There's a limit to how much you can zoom in on a picture by clicking and dragging in PowerPoint. It's a bit fiddly. Let's just try, I'm going to just click on that and type 400 in there, see what that does. Okay, so it's a little bit too big. There we go, I'm going to move that up. I'm not going to do the entire presentation, don't worry. This is just an example. There we go, so that'll do. So now on this slide, I can zoom back in now. I know that this is the content of my slide, so I can add a text box. Let's add a text box here. Fill that text box the size of my sign, the notice board here, and then I can start typing in that. So let's edit the text. Hello, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. And we'll just make that font a little bit bigger. We'll center it, change the font to white. There we go. So now if we run the presentation, what happens, there's our island. Next slide, of course, just spins the island around so we can see the other side. And then we're going to zoom in onto that signboard, notice board. Now you'll see that what happens there is the text appears slightly before the signpost does. So to avoid that, what we need to do is click on this text box and go to animations. And I'm going to click on add animation and fade. And I'm going to have this fade in. I think it's okay if we do it as after previous. So I'm going to do after previous like that, and then press F5. Let's run the presentation again. So slide 1, slide 2, slide 3, and then the text appears. There we go, perfect. Now what you'll want to do then is probably have your next slide, but I tend to put a break in between each notice board, so you're not just flying around the island looking at the notice boards. You've built the island, you've made all that stuff, you've added all that detail. Let's enjoy it. So I'm going to duplicate this first slide and drag that down underneath this one here. And then what I'm going to do is decide which side am I going to zoom into next. And I think it's going to be this one on the right over here. So what I'm going to do now is duplicate this slide, and you have to keep duplicating every time so that Morph is able to work out what needs to be moved and how it needs to be moved excuse me, between each one. So let's now rotate this model around, move that signpost into the middle. We'll click format and we'll just increase it to about 400 so it's nice and big. And there we go. It's moved off too far. There we go. Let's move that up there. And then to move it in position, we'll just use the arrow keys and the thumbnail. Now, there's only one other thing to show you on this, because pretty much the rest of it, I imagine you can work out. So things like changing the background, of course, fairly straightforward. But if I just now copy that text box onto this signpost there, oh, I lined that up pretty well. Each signpost might need to have the text box moved around, of course, or even rotated perhaps as well. That needs a slight bit of rotation, but I'm not going to worry too much about it. So once you've done that, you'll see that what happens now, we sort of rotate around the island, there we go, then we zoom in on the first notice board, and then when we go to the next view, the text again hangs around for a while afterwards. So what we need to do is to again click on the text and go into animations. We've added an animation for the appearance. What I do is add another animation, and this is for fade out. So in the exit section, fade out, and this one I leave as on click. So I'm going to do that. Let's just duplicate that one again, and then click on this notice board, add an animation for fade out, leave it as on click. So now if I go into the presentation, there we are, rotate around, zoom in on the first signpost, there we are. Then we zoom out and you see how the text disappears before we zoom out. Then zoom in again on the next signpost and there we go. Text goes, we move out. Now you will notice there that that zoom between I think this slide and this slide was very, very quick. So I think what I would probably do is change the transition time here. Duration's 2 seconds. I think I would increase that. Let's try 4 seconds, see what that would look like. So let's run it from that place. Okay, so I think that was a little bit slower, but you can play around with the timings. You don't want to make the audience feel seasick by lurching them all over the place, but a little bit of animation I think is good. It makes it a little bit more interesting. So pretty much that's it, other than changing the background, of course, to other colors. If you wanted to have a night sky or something, then you easily could. So we can change the background here and change that to a nice night sky. So let's have a dark blue in there and a bit of purple at the bottom, something like that perhaps. And by doing that, we can have our island, and then the background will change behind it. Or we could change the motion of the island as daytime fades out into nighttime, something like that. And there we go. So then we've got something like this. There we go. So there we are. You can see how we can just carry on playing with this for quite a long time here. But I really like that. I really like the idea of being able to build your models in Blender quite simply, bring them into PowerPoint and use those as the basis for your presentation. So I know this is a long tutorial. If you've stuck with me throughout, well done, and thank you so much. If you enjoyed it, and I hope you did, if you stuck through to this far, then I imagine you probably did, then please do like this video. That does make a real difference to the channel. So please do click like if you enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any comments, any questions, any suggestions at all, then do please leave them below. I do read all comments. I do make my best effort to reply in a timely fashion to all comments. So get involved, leave a like, leave a comment, and of course if you've not subscribed to the channel yet, this is your first video perhaps, then do please click the subscribe button. That would be fantastic, and you will then of course be the first to know when a new video tutorial comes out, and I have a lot of new video tutorials planned. Quite a lot from viewers actually from previous videos who have said, can I do this, can I do that? So that's another way of getting help if you would like to get involved. So thank you very much again indeed for watching. I hope to see you in the next video, and I hope to hear from you in the comments section below. But for now, thank you very much indeed, and bye.